Thank you for joining this biology session on Lesson 5. In this section, we'll be going over Chapter 33, all three sections of the chapter, and you'll see practice questions that you can follow along with, but there's no way to submit them for grading or anything. You just follow along with what we do. And this chapter is on the circulatory and respiratory systems. And before we begin this section, I just want to give a warning that for this entire chapter, there is a lot of discussion about blood. There's no actual photos of blood or organs, but there's many diagrams of the heart, circulatory system, and blood components. You know that the heart pumps blood through your body, but why? Well, the circulatory system is amazing. It's a network of vessels that go from your heart and lungs out to every tissue of your body and back. The goal is to deliver oxygen and nutrients to your cells and to take away carbon dioxide and other waste from your cells. The human circulatory system is closed, meaning that the blood never leaves the blood vessels, but instead, tiny blood vessels reach out to all of your tissues so that all of the cells in your body can be serviced. Here are some words that you will see when going through this. Pulmonary is a word meaning it has to do with the lungs. Cardio, cardiac, or cardium means it has to do with the heart. Myo means muscle. So if you put those two together, myocardium is the heart's muscle. And systemic means the rest of the body tissues. I'm going to mix up the order that is in your book a little and discuss blood vessels before discussing the heart. So arteries are blood vessels that take blood away from the heart. Their blood is under high pressure, so the walls of arteries are thick. Arteries branch off into smaller and smaller vessels as they go into the various organs of the body. Eventually, they branch off so small that they become tiny capillaries. Capillaries are very small blood vessels that spread throughout the body's tissues. They allow the circulatory system to interact with the cells of the body's tissues because capillaries have thin walls, so they allow oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and waste to diffuse back and forth through the walls between the blood and the tissues. Then the blood continues on through the veins, which are blood vessels leading back to the heart. And veins have valves that only allow the blood to flow one way, so it can't flow backwards. This is a simplified diagram showing the connections. So you have arteries, which branch off into capillaries, and then the capillaries kind of come back together and drain into veins. Now, in real life, there are much more capillaries connecting each artery and vein. And I also want to point out that in these diagrams throughout the circulatory system, they're always going to show red as being oxygen rich. So something that came from the lungs and it's got a lot of oxygen. And then blue is going to be oxygen poor, where the body took all the oxygen out of the blood and now it's got to go back to get more. Now, that's how they show it in the diagrams, but remember that blood is never actually blue. Even oxygen-poor blood is red. And if you can see veins through your skin and they look blue, that's just the vessels and the way the light is filtered through your skin, but the blood in them is still red. Okay, blood is always going to be some shade of red. Whoops. Okay, so before we move on, I want to go over a quick practice question. So we're going to match the blood vessels to their functions. And I kind of accidentally showed you the first one already, but think about the others. So carry the blood away from the heart, carry blood back to the heart, and allow gases and nutrients to diffuse into tissues. Which are those three? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. And you can pause this video, of course, if you need more time to think. So carrying blood away from the heart is the arteries. An easy way to remember that is arteries move away. They both start with an A. Carrying blood back to the heart is the veins. And then allowing the gases and nutrients to diffuse into and out of tissues is the capillaries. The flow of blood through the heart has 4 stages. It receives blood from the body, pumps it to the lungs to get oxygen, receives oxygenated blood from the lungs, and then pumps blood out to the rest of the body. In order to do this, the heart has 4 chambers, each one a hollow cavity made of strong muscle. Before we look at them, I just want to clarify that when we diagram the heart, we do that so it looks as if we're looking at someone's body face on. So the person's right side is on the left side of your screen. So the labels on your diagram are correct. It's going to show right, even though it's on the left side of the screen, and left, even though it's on the right side of the screen. Okay, so now we'll go over how the blood flows through those 4 chambers. So first, the right atrium is the upper chamber of the heart on the right side, which receives blood from the body through veins called the vena cava. Okay, so you should probably know vena cava also. That atrium contracts, squeezing the blood through a valve into the right ventricle. And then the right ventricle contracts, pumping the blood to the lungs through a pulmonary artery. There, the blood loses carbon dioxide and gains oxygen. Once the blood has gone through the lungs and picked up oxygen, it drains from the lungs into the left atrium through pulmonary veins and then moves down into the left ventricle when that atrium contracts. The left ventricle then contracts, pumping the blood into the aorta, which branches off into all the arteries that lead to the rest of the body. So basically, the heart has 2 pumps on 2 separate circuits. The right side of the heart pumps blood to the lungs, called pulmonary circulation, and the left side of the heart pumps blood to the rest of the body, called systemic circulation. And in the description below and the end of the video is a link to a really great short video showing this process with a very clear animation. So be sure to watch that as well. The 2 atria contract at the same time, and then the 2 ventricles contract at the same time, creating the lub-dub sound of a heartbeat. The timing of the heartbeats is controlled by a small group of fibers called the SA node, which send an electrical signal to the atria telling them to contract. And there's the SA node sending the signal across to the atria. Though blood is flowing through the inside of the heart, that is not where the heart gets its oxygen supply. There are special arteries that go to the heart muscle, taking it fresh oxygenated blood, and these are called the coronary arteries. And this diagram shows the coronary arteries and veins spreading across the heart. A heart attack is what happens when the blood doesn't properly get through these arteries to the heart, and so the heart doesn't get enough oxygen to function properly. And that brings us to the end of this section. So we have a review question. So select all of these that have oxygen-rich blood. So blood that's come from the lungs, and the oxygen hasn't been taken out of it by the body yet. So I'll give you a few seconds to think about which answers are right, and there's definitely more than one. Okay, so blood comes from the body into the right atrium. So the right atrium and ventricle are not oxygen rich. Okay, they get oxygen poor blood from the body. So that's not correct. Left atrium, though, that is correct. So the oxygen goes, or the blood goes to the lungs, picks up the oxygen, goes to the left atrium and the left ventricle, then pumps out to the aorta, which is the big artery that goes from the heart with all the oxygenated blood, and also pulmonary veins. So remember, veins go back to the heart, and pulmonary means to do with the lungs. So pulmonary veins are coming from the lungs back to the heart. So they definitely have a lot of oxygen. Section 2 is about blood itself and lymphatic system. So blood is a tissue. It's made mostly of plasma, which is a fluid made out of water, and it has oxygen, carbon dioxide, salts, and various compounds suspended in it. Plasma is then filled with some other things. It's filled with red blood cells and white blood cells and platelets. So we'll talk about those. Red blood cells are the most numerous cells in the blood, which is why blood appears red. They have a compound in them called hemoglobin, which carries oxygen and releases it at the body tissues, and it picks up carbon dioxide and carries it to the lungs. Hemoglobin contains iron, which makes the blood appear red. Red blood cells are a bit different from most other cells in the body. After being made in the bone marrow, they quickly lose their nucleus and other organelles. They don't need them because their only job is to carry gases. They live for about 120 days, and then they die, and the iron in the hemoglobin is recycled. White blood cells are for immunity. The body makes different types of white blood cells which each fight pathogens. These, unlike the red blood cells, can actually live for years, and some white blood cells can even leave the capillaries and go out into the tissues to fight pathogens there. Platelets are tiny fragments of cells that float in the blood, ready to create a blood clot if a vessel is cut or broken open. And these are the steps to that. So if there's a break in a blood vessel, so if you get a paper cut or something, platelets will first clump together at the clot. This triggers a complicated series of reactions within the blood and ends up making sticky filaments called fibrin, which form a clot, and that prevents more blood loss. So those are the steps to that happening, really simplified. Now, lymph is another fluid that moves through the body in an entirely different set of vessels. It's made of plasma from blood along with other cells. It collects into lymphatic capillaries, which take the lymph from lymph nodes. Which takes the lymph to lymph nodes, which filter out pathogens, broken cells, and other debris. And the lymph system takes nutrients from the intestines and then delivers this cleaned, nutrient-filled lymph back to the circulatory system. So the two systems are connected, but they have separate sets of vessels. And some diseases of the circulatory system include heart disease, which is due to a lack of oxygen in the myocardium. Again, if this is severe and damages the heart muscle, it's called a heart attack. This is often caused by atherosclerosis, a condition in which fatty deposits called plaque build up in the arteries and inhibit the flow of blood. Stroke is when a clot or a broken blood vessel blocking the blood flow to part of the brain. And hypertension is the word for high blood pressure. This means there's more pressure in the arteries, making the heart struggle to pump blood, and this could lead to heart attack, stroke, and kidney problems. Cholesterol is a molecule that the body uses for several purposes, but too much of it is a problem. There are two types. HDL is what we call the good cholesterol. It basically helps the body remove the bad cholesterol. LDL is the bad cholesterol, and too much of it causes plaque to build up in the arteries, causing atherosclerosis, which leads to heart attack. When their liver has receptors for LDL, so the LDL binds to those receptors and is taken into the liver, broken down, and stored. But when the diet is too high in cholesterol and there's too much LDL, the liver stops collecting it, and so it remains in the blood and then builds up as plaque in the arteries. Okay, a review question before we move on. Match the job of the cell to the type of cell it is. So which ones carry oxygen and carbon dioxide? That's red blood cells. The ones that clump together at the cuts, triggering formation of blood clots, are platelets. Those actually aren't entire cells, they're just little fragments of cells. And then the ones that fight pathogens are the white blood cells. And the last section in this chapter is the respiratory system. So we already discussed that the circulatory system takes oxygens from the lungs to the rest of the body and then brings carbon dioxide from the rest of the body to the lungs. So this section explains how the lungs are connected to the outside air and how gas is exchanged between the lungs and the blood. So air comes in through the nose, which is filtered by nose hair and mucus, which is gross, but also really helpful. You don't want dust getting into your sensitive lungs. Humans can also breathe through their mouths, but not all animals can. Some animals can only breathe through their noses. So air comes in through the nose and then goes to an area called the pharynx, which contains the vocal cord. Oh, sorry. First to the pharynx, then to the larynx, which contains the vocal cords, then to the trachea, which is the pipe that goes to the lungs, and finally ends up in the lungs. So let's look at the lungs themselves. There are tubes in the lungs called bronchi, which branch off into smaller and smaller paths called bronchioles. They end in tiny air sacs called alveoli. The bronchioles end in tiny air sacs called alveoli, which are in contact with capillaries. In fact, the alveoli are just basically covered in capillaries. And this is where the gas exchange happens. These areas are moist so that oxygen can dissolve into that moisture, and then it diffuses across the capillaries into the blood. Meanwhile, carbon dioxide is diffusing from the capillaries back into the lungs. Now, this diffusion only works if there's a lower concentration of oxygen in the lungs. So you get some oxygen, that's the little blue circles in this diagram, is going to move into the blood. And at this point, more diffusion wouldn't really happen in this diagram. So the hemoglobin takes oxygen out of the plasma and into the red blood cells, which keeps the oxygen content in the plasma low enough that diffusion continues and you get more oxygen in the blood. Now we can breathe air in and out by changing the pressure in our lungs. So to breathe in, the diaphragm, which is that green line in this diagram, it pushes the rib cage outward, which expands the chest, lowering the air pressure, giving more room for the lungs. This decrease of air pressure lets air rush in. Then when the diaphragm relaxes, the rib cage moves inward, increasing the pressure on lungs and pushing air out. Then you also have muscles attached to the ribs, and those muscles can also squeeze in and apply additional force to get forced air out. And the rate of that breathing is controlled by carbon dioxide levels sensed in the brain. So if the brain senses too much carbon dioxide, it signals the diaphragm and the chest muscles to breathe faster. Smoking is dangerous for several reasons. Nicotine increases the heart rate and blood pressure, and it's addictive, so it makes you continue doing it. The tar found in cigarettes has many ingredients in it that cause cancer. Carbon monoxide that's found in cigarette smoke decreases the amount of oxygen that your blood can carry. And particles in the smoke cause physical damage to the trachea and lungs, causing several diseases. So that brings us to the end of this chapter. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact an instructor.